Hello, my name is Stacey Joyce, and I am pleased to welcome you for today's PIR live event from Partners in Research Canada. If you're joining us live, please do find your way to the chat button in the top left corner of your screen and ask us a question anytime throughout the webinar, and we'll queue it up for after our guest's presentation. Make sure that you include where you're joining from, or perhaps what grade your students are, or even a first name of a student. If it's one student's question, we'd be happy to give you a shout out when we ask on your behalf. And if you send that in the to field there to all attendees as well as panelists, then the other classes who are joining from around the country will be able to see what your class is asking. So, today's guest is Eden Hennessey. She is a PhD candidate in social psychology and a research associate at the Laurier Center for Women in Science, or WINS, and she is also a data-driven artist, all at Laurier University. So thank you so much for joining us, Eden. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stacey. And hello to everyone who's out there. I'm hoping that everyone's staying somewhat warm. I know we're having some unseasonable weather. And so I'm, as Stacey mentioned, I'm finishing my PhD currently right now in social psychology, and I'm hoping to talk to you about some of my dissertation work today, but also some of the work that I'm doing with the Center for Women in Science, which is a research center that's focused on promoting research by and about women in science fields. And so I'm going to be sharing a little presentation with you today. And I'll just get that started now. Just give me 1 second. Sorry, Stacey.
That's okay. Do you need any help to get it up, or we just need that second?
I'm actually not sure. So sorry.
That's okay. I'll walk you through it. This is what happens. This is live stuff here.
I want to share this, but I also want it to be real big so we can get
okay. So we're on our way now.
I think I'm there. I think I got it.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay, like I said, this is our logo for the Center for Women in Science, which is actually a geodesic dome, which is pretty interesting as well. It originates from an actual structure within the natural world. So look at this picture. Who is this? Well, a lot of us know this person. We know Barbie, and many of us have a love-hate relationship with her. So a lot of people, when I say, when do you think Barbie said math is hard? Let's go shopping. When do you think they said that? A lot of people say it must have been so long ago. And I say, actually, it was 1992. And that was when a lot of current university students were buying Christmas presents, out buying toys. This was not too long ago. So although 92, some people think it's ancient history, some people think it's pretty recent, we don't have to look too far to find these messages that women are inconsistent with math and science concepts. So Barbie tried again in 2014. She published a book, Barbie's going to be a computer engineer. However, this time Barbie needed the help of her male friends to turn her ideas into a real game. And so these kind of ideas that we see in pop culture are actually more common than we'd like to recognize. So even from people who are in science themselves, for instance, a Nobel Prize scientist who was criticized for saying that, well, women fall in love when they're in the lab and you can't criticize them because they cry. So that's just one instance. Now, what really got my attention about that example, as someone who studies sexism, meaning discrimination against people based on sex and gender, particularly I look at women. So how women responded to this kind of comment about women in the lab was going to social media with this hashtag distractingly sexy and saying, look, here I am in the lab, here I am doing, my job, and I'm look how distracting I must be. So it was a very tongue-in-cheek, humorous form of confrontation. You can see this very scantily clad person. This person here just did a liver transplant without crying or falling in love. So this, as a researcher of confrontation, I found this really exciting, and it inspired me so much that I thought, I'm going to make my own photo exhibit of, I love photography, I love art. How do I turn this into a message that can reach the most people? So I created my own exhibit called Distractingly Sexist, which a piece is actually right here behind me, featuring real women in science. And I wanted to share with you a few of the comments that I got. I'm studying the costs of confronting sexism in science. And by virtue of this, I call this me search because this was a personal experience now. So some of these comments you'll notice are things like denial or typical tactics we see in response to claims of discrimination, like, what about men? They're not in school as much as women, allegedly face gender discrimination. So questioning validity of women's arguments. calling names is a very another common response. So this is more sort of hostile sexism. And then something we call benevolent sexism, which is subjectively more positive, commenting on things like your appearance and your body. And this is consistent with objectification. And so, I mean, I've lived this experience as a researcher as well, but I wanted to tell you, you know, given this experience, it might not be so surprising to you that we see very few women being retained in science, technology, engineering, and math, and those are STEM fields. So all of these pictures that I'm putting in this presentation as well, by the way, are real scientists. So they're women that I've recruited for this project to try and change the way that we're seeing women in science and thinking about who they are and what they look like. And so I've just popped a few stats in here showing that, you know, 30% of STEM grads only in Canada are women, and 25% of engineering graduates. So we're seeing really a disparity of women in computer science and engineering mostly. And when women are getting hired, unfortunately, we're seeing that they're getting fewer full-time jobs and have less access to resources and experience, and report more sexual harassment than their male colleagues. And so, yes, that is me with a lot of makeup on. And so, yes, we do see that this negative stereotyping and sexism based on discrimination of your gender is happening across schools. It's also happening within careers. And I found in some of my research at the school that I'm at that some students even reported being called weirdos and witches, really, really showing the inconsistent message that women don't belong in math and science. Now, one option we have with something like sexism is to confront it. We know it works. We know confronting works. However, you also might face a cost. So it's a catch-22. You can confront, but you might be viewed negatively, fear retaliation, be labeled as a complainer. And this can happen from both male and female participants who witness a confrontation. But like I said, we know it works. So we need people to enact it. So why do I think in my dissertation research that women in science will face greater costs for confronting than other women? Well, the first reason is that STEM careers are typically seen as more masculine and arts are seen as more feminine. And this was done research with thousands of participants over 34 countries around the world. The second reason is that confrontation contradicts female stereotypes of submissiveness or being very agreeable. And so when we put these factors together, this is what I test. I test if women who confront in science versus another field will actually face sort of a double dose of this hostility or cost for violating two stereotypes. And that's exactly what my dissertation research is on. There's the title of it there, Confronting Sexism in STEM. And I'm establishing, so research hasn't done this. We don't know this question, the answer to this question. And so in the methods that I use, we have to create a situation in which confrontation can occur and make sense experimentally. So we ask people using hypothetical scenarios to read a sexism prime. And what I mean by prime is something that conditions you to think a certain thing is happening. So for instance, you might read a statement like, girls just aren't as smart as boys in math. And then I would have participants either imagine that they confront themselves, or they're reading about a woman who is confronting, or that they ignore, or they read about a woman who's ignoring. And then I ask, you know, what do you think of her if you just read about this woman ignoring or confronting? And also, what will other people think of you? And then I ask different variables that I call STEM retention variables, like how hard do you think STEM is? Because we know that difficulty can predict attrition from these fields. And so what I find in my research, in the first study, it was men and women, and I found some gender differences there, such that male participants especially disliked this female confronter for standing up in science, whereas the opposite was true for female participants who said, when I watched that woman confront, I thought she was warmer and smarter. And so this is encouraging because it suggests that if we get more women into science fields, that we can actually increase, you know, the chances of somebody having your back. So I think that's a really important finding. In the second study, we also found some evidence that women in STEM who confronted, so these are women in science themselves, they thought other people would see them as bossier if they confronted versus ignored. And they reported that they thought computer science was more difficult than when they imagined ignoring. So that suggests that that confronting sexism could be taking up some kind of cognitive resource. And in our third study, we had people imagine different ways to confront. And we found that actively confronting, so using something like anger, if you were confronting hostile or overt sexism, that actually reduced women's self-esteem and increased the costs that they reported facing. So now in my future research, what I'm looking at is how to reduce the perception of these social costs so that we can encourage more women in science to confront, with that end goal of ultimately increasing retention in science fields. And so based on all of those research findings, then I've turned these into visuals. And so, I mean, we all have, I wish I could see a show of hands right now, because I would say how many of you have Instagram accounts, because you'd probably all say everyone. It's an Insta world. So I thought, let's capitalize on that visual nature of these materials and communicating a scientific message by putting faces to some of these issues. And so how does one do that? And this is the process that I generally use. So like I've told you about the research up until this point, I design studies like all other researchers. We conduct the research using a variety of online and in-lab methods. We analyze the data using statistics for social sciences. And then we have to interpret what those findings mean. So how do we actually distill that down into something that is palatable and accessible to everyone, not just PhDs, not just people in the academy, but to everybody? How do we talk about this? And who could capture this? Do I know somebody? Do I know, one of these women from the local tech community who could really capture that message? And that's when I visualize, and that can be in terms of just drawing a picture of something that is, this is what I think it should look like. And then I head into a photography studio with professionals with very expensive equipment that I can't afford as a PhD student. And we make these visions come to life. And I'm going to share a few of those with you now. And so this is Ella, and Ella is 6 months old in this photo. And what I did here was, this is from the second photo series called #DistractinglyHonest. And this series was inspired by the reactions to the first series, which was called Distractingly Sexist. And some of the responses that I got were people saying things like, honestly, Eden, it's really like this. Honestly, I tell people I don't experience this, but really I've experienced X, Y, and Z. And so I thought I should call this about distractingly honest and make these pieces about being honestly influential, honestly challenging, whatever the term would be. And so this first piece speaks about, we know that there are lots of programs for girls. We know that that STEM camps have great uptake, but what we don't talk about often is how honestly influential early childhood experiences are. So the moment that we give a toy to a girl or a boy, there can be implications associated with that, such that we could be confirming or disconfirming a stereotype that might actually influence what they do down the road in their lives. And so for this image, I just asked, real parents to bring me girl toys and boy toys. And what you can see is that on the left, we have the boy toys, which are really focused on utilitarian things like building and doing. And then the girls ones on the right, which are really focused on being pretty, doing your makeup, wearing heels. So we can really get a sense just from this image that here's this child with kind of these multitude of options in front of her, and the influence that has is really important to talk about. So we have seen some important growth over the last few years. So there's something called a draw and engineer test. And the draw and engineer test has been going on since the 80s. And what that shows is that most children draw a man when they're asked to draw an engineer. But now we're seeing for the first time in history, not that kids are drawing more women than men as engineers, but they are drawing more women than they have ever historically. And so we are seeing some influence of these messages changing over time, which is really encouraging. And so in this next piece, I'm using a bit of humor, and this is a professor, Don Baisley. These are folks from York University in Toronto, Jennifer Zomaritis, who's in astronomy. And these women here, really what I'm doing is I'm playing on the commentary that I hear from a lot of participants, that if you want to survive in STEM, you need to act like a man. So I'm taking this to the umpteenth sort of satirical point of view here, not to trivialize gender in any means, but just to highlight that many women in STEM report downplaying their feminine characteristics in order to fit in with a more masculine environment. And so this is, of course, the extreme case of doing that. And so that piece was honestly equal. And now if we kind of go along with the narrative that things are honestly equal, and we men and women are having the same experiences, we risk ignoring the fact that women's experiences in academia and within science are honestly challenging. And so this is a young mom with her baby. This is, not something we've cooked up in the lab. This is a real life PhD student with her baby. This was the first time he'd slept in days, Oliver. And to create this image, we really wanted to portray all of the multiple roles that women are experiencing in science, such that they're the mother, they're the researcher, they're the academic, they're the significant other, they're doing the grocery shopping, they're working constantly. And to really talk about the, what that does to somebody's psychological experience, but also their career trajectory when they're balancing all of these different challenges. So that's Amanda Denoyer. She's about to graduate with her PhD. She's moving on to be a research scientist with the government. And so what I talk about is, yes, these costs of confronting sexism in science. And here's Helen Ramirez. She's my only non-scientist, actually. She's a women and gender studies professor, but she's half wearing the scientist coat because she said, I'm not one of you in science, but I stand with you. And so I'm an ally. And I think that that's really important to talk about too, is how to increase women's networks so that they have allies even in other fields. And so these are some of the terms taken from my research that women who are confronting sexism in science may face. On the one hand, they may face being called a complainer or a troublemaker, but they also might face positive perceptions such that people will think they're smarter and warmer and brave. And so there is really this double-edged sword going on to the cost of confrontation. But the whole goal here is to get women honestly empowered enough to take action to make that change systemically within their own departments and within their own programs. This is Marissa Sterling, and she is the Dean of Inclusivity and Diversity at Lausanne School of Engineering, which is an offshoot of York University. And they're really a really interesting organization because they put gender equity front and center. They value diversity to the next level, and it's embedded in all of their programming. And so this Marissa here is herself is a PN, specifically, I believe, a chemical engineer. And so in this shot, she's busting through this perception of women as, fragile creatures, and she's empowered enough to take action against this discrimination that she's perceiving. And in doing so, the goal, like I mentioned before, is to really retain as many women as we can. So in this image, this is my mentor and a professor, also a TED fellow. She's got a great TED talk on Marie Curie, Dr. Shalini Ghosh, who's a quantum physicist, and she is actually the director for the Center for Women in Science. And in this image, I mean, I had something like, here's what I want to do, Shalini, and I want to portray this image of you. And in my mind, she's a superhero. Like many of you have mentors, and you look at them and you actually see a cape, like in your imagination. So that's how I see her. But she said to me, I don't really like that image that you're planning. So how can we capture what it is that, the message that we're trying to portray, but something that I actually like. So she runs to her car, she grabs this fiber optic light. This is what she does. She works with light and lasers. And she came back and she said, let's do something with light. And I want to talk about, as a woman of color, how I feel invisible often, how I'm, yes, she would never say she's honestly ingenious. I would say that to her. It's about shedding light on these ingenious thinkers and these innovators and really capitalizing on the best and brightest minds that we have, because we know that we want to solve problems with all of the best people working on this. We don't want to solve problems with half of the people left outside the room because of their gender. If I'm going to get heart surgery, I want all of the best surgeons there. I don't want to exclude half of the best surgeons in the world because they're women. And so this is really an example here of Shalini Ghosh. She's holding light. It's a beacon to sort of shine a light on these historically invisible women in STEM. And another way I think that we can do that is to encourage people to be honestly interdisciplinary. And this is something that we're seeing more and more encouraged in post-secondary, and I think also at the elementary level and high school levels too. So being interdisciplinary simply means not reinventing the wheel. You borrow good ideas and collaborate with people who are experts in different fields so that you don't end up being overwhelmed with trying to solve all of the world's problems on your own. So in this case, this is Vanessa Macarius. She runs a business in Toronto called The Math Guru. It makes math tutoring cool. She also fronts a band playing this guitar. And so she really, she's a real rock star. And at the same time, her and I both have these experiences of being, sort of standing away from the STEM culture, but also then having another piece of our identity that's very much a part of that. And I certainly identify with that as an artist as well. And so I think that by highlighting being honestly interdisciplinary, that's one way we can sort of enculture people to, gain support from others and find allyship. And so in this final piece I'm showing you here, this is a periodic table, which I call the essential elements, and I've replaced the essential elements in a table, of course, of elements here with all of the women who participate in these projects. And I've also embedded within this a message that with more women in science, she wins, but also he wins within that. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing any of this with you and hearing your questions. And you can also get in touch with me in these ways and follow me on Twitter.
Well, thank you so much. That was certainly a lot of really great information. And it's so interesting the way you have studied this and looked at specific statistics, yet decided to present your findings in this really artistic fashion that is a bit more emotional, I think, for people than just reading some percentages or proportions and as such. So if you want to go ahead and click the stop share button now, we'll be able to see you a little bit larger on the screen. Perfect.
Sure.
And we'll get to some questions. We certainly have some already. The first one I want to ask you is from Valley Park Middle School, and I believe it's Iman who has asked, why is it that women are the ones who are discriminated and excluded, maybe perhaps instead of men?
Right, and that's a great question, and I think a lot of that rests on stereotypes. So what are stereotypes? So stereotype perceptions are the perceptions that are based on gross generalizations. So where there might be an instance, a grain of truth to that, we can't overgeneralize and say, you know, like Stacy and I right here, we're both young women with brown hair and glasses, so we must all like chocolate ice cream, right? So we can't really take an example like that and say that it applies to everybody. However, in social science, we do look at averages. And on average, women face this challenge because, like I was arguing, they violate stereotypes. So systemically and historically, science has been a male-dominated profession. And so we've all grown up in a world in which seeing men in science is the norm. And so then when we see women in science, that violates that gender norm. And we think of that as kind of bizarre. So this is really about adjusting our perceptions of who belongs in each of these science fields. And so the more, I firmly believe, the more that we get women into these roles, the less that we're actually going to start to have these conversations, because it will, in the end, I think the issue is going to address itself. So why women? I think stereotype violation is probably the biggest one. And then also a lack of systemic and institutional support. So the systems that we live in science and academia were created by all men who were, I mean, that was who occupied these spaces. So there's often a lack of things like parental leave or maternal leave policies in place that can actually really make a difference in retaining women. And so we have to kind of look at it culturally and say, what are we all seeing that's problematic or that we could see differently? And then how do we embed that into our institutions so that we can address some of these challenges?
Right. And we have a question now from Ms. Sloss's class wondering, why does it matter if women are in STEM? Why is there this big push?
That's true. Yeah. And I mean, I go big with that. That's a great question. And I think that it really does matter because, like I said, we need to have all of the best and most qualified people working on the problems that face us as humanity. So things like climate change. So when we think about, you know, if we're assembling a team to work on addressing climate change, do we want half of the people to be excluded from that team just because of a demographic variable like their gender? I mean, that's going to put us all back, you know, potentially hundreds of years of progress if we're missing out on these discoveries. I mean, it's important that we get everybody into STEM, because what if the cure to cancer is out there in some little girl's mind and we can't access it, right? What if these amazing potentials for discovery lie within the minds of people that we don't hear from? If we're not hearing from those voices, then we're not getting those ideas. And so really, ultimately, it matters to get people into science so that we can maximize our potential as all of humanity.
So if I understand correctly, then it's not necessarily a push for more women in STEM than men. We essentially just want the doors to be open to everyone so that those who are most passionate and most talented and work hardest in that STEM area can be successful regardless of whether they're male or female.
That's right. And a lot of programs are really focusing on numbers, which some people criticize and say are arbitrary, and things like, you know, why 50-50? Like, why would you want, I mean, when you look at professions like teaching and nursing, those are certainly not gender equal, right? Those are predominantly female dominated. And so the reason that it's important is a couple of reasons. So the one is that these positions that are held by science and technology professionals are often the highest paid. And so this inadvertently contributes to the gender wage gap, because we see that men, for instance, I'm in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is called the Silicon Valley of the North. And we have Google here, we have a ton of tech incubators and startups, and so we generate a lot of money. However, because of that concentration of those professions in this area, we actually have the biggest gender wage gap in all of Canada. So that is evidence to speak to. We need to get more women into science and tech roles so that they can be bringing home the bank, right? So that we can be getting equal pay for equal work in contexts where the work is based in science and tech. So I think that it's absolutely, yeah, it's not a push to say that there should be more women than men, or we should be pushing women into STEM who don't want to be there. It's simply removing the barriers so that anyone can access it if they want to.
Right. And you mentioned the influence that those early years play. So even younger than the students who are joining us today, I have two little children, and I have a boy and a girl, and the differences that I see are so striking in what is marketed to each of them. As you said, lots of doing and vehicles, construction, all that stuff for the boys, and for the girls, it's all about role playing and dress up. And we're seeing more and more crossover now. There are sort of gender neutral things or building things that are also being marketed towards.
Yeah, Goldilocks, and we're seeing a ton of different stuff hitting the market, and that's really, I mean, at the same time as we're having conversations about, destroying stereotypes about what women are capable of doing, we also are working on stereotypes about what men are capable of doing. So learning to spread that message that men and boys, it's okay if you want to go into a nurturing or caring profession. That might also violate stereotypes. However, I mean, something that's really interesting to note is that we all have heard the term, or if you haven't heard the term, the glass ceiling. So women in male-dominated professions tend to get to a certain level and then they can't bust through, right, to get any higher. So the opposite is actually, research has found the opposite is true for men in female-dominated professions. So it's actually something. Sorry, I'm reading a question, but it's actually something, I lost my train of thought. Oh no, bring me back, Stacey, bring me back.
So we were talking about the glass ceiling with women
so
in
the opposite is actually true. Thank you for men in female-dominated professions, such that they get on the glass escalator. So they're more likely to be promoted right to a management position. And so these kind of differences are reflected in the research. So I would encourage you to go on Google Scholar. That's all open source. You don't have to have a university login to access that information. You can read about the glass ceiling and the glass escalator and the different implications of those for men and women.
Wonderful. We definitely have a few more questions I want to get to, even though we're approaching 1:30. We have a question now from Sean, who is a grade 6 student at Westridge Elementary in BC. Thanks so much for your question, Sean. Sean's wondering, why is breaking the stereotypes such a big problem? Why is it this difficult?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sean. And if we had a magic wand like that I could just wave and we'd get rid of all stereotypes, that would certainly be the discovery of the last several centuries. Because stereotypes are so hard to destroy because they operate on almost an automatic level. So what that means is that they operate beneath our conscious awareness. So there are stereotypes that we hold about different social groups that are activated automatically. So for instance, the classic studies, again, you can go to Google Scholar and find any of this stuff, but there's a lot of classic studies on things like looking at race and the object that you're holding in your hand. And so what experimenters have actually done is show an image of a white man or a black man with an object in their hand, and they're actually able to show that more quickly we assume that the black man is holding a weapon, and whereas the white man is not. So that actually speaks to the implicit level of bias or stereotypes that we hold about these racial groups. And certainly we still see that playing, like look what just happened in the Starbucks in the States, right? So we're really, I mean, this is something, these attitudes are extremely difficult to move once they've been shaped. And I think that's why we're seeing such difficulty in challenging them, because we lay the groundwork from infancy, and then it's reinforced again in our cultural norms by what we see around us. And so breaking that cycle is really difficult.
Right. Maybe we could go next to a question from the grade 7 class in Kingston. They were wondering if you could sort of summarize or highlight some of the most prominent ways that women are treated differently in STEM.
Right, and so that can be operationalized in several different ways. And so when we talk about the disparities that they're actually facing, so how are they treated differently? So there are often these instances where people can't detect whether it's discrimination or not. So it's not always that it's this over the head instance of somebody touching you inappropriately or saying something inappropriate to you, but often it's these ambiguous situations in which you can't figure out if you are being targeted or not, such that, for example, this is something I hear a lot, I was the only woman in a meeting, and then I got asked to make the coffee. So was I asked to make the coffee because I was sitting closest to the coffee machine, or was it because I'm the woman in the room and the assumption is that I'll be doing the sort of caretaking of everyone? So it's these little instances that can really build up over time and be really indicative of stereotypes and gender norms that we're projecting onto people. But this is also, I mean, women in STEM are treated differently in some of the ways that are also more overt. Things like experiencing sexual assault on field sites, statistically far more often than their male colleagues. Also not being credited for their work as often. Or being excluded from, picture you're in a lab that's all men, and they all go out for whiskey and golf, and you're just not invited because you're the only woman and you really don't fit in with that social group. Well, then you're going to miss out on those workplace conversations and those potential collaborations that'll come of it. So often the exclusion is socially related as well. But I'd be definitely happy to send you and Stacey all the information we have on the specific barriers, because developmentally there's some at almost every stage that we're counteracting, and so the list is abundant.
It sounds like it's just a really, really complicated issue to study. I do want to get to a couple more questions here, but maybe we can go, we've talked a lot about the status of where things are at and why this is difficult. And maybe we could talk about a question from Ms. Katsko's class asking, do you know what picture you've taken or a program you've heard of that has impacted these stereotypes or helped break down these stereotypes the most?
Yeah, you know what? I think it would have to be the one of the baby. And it's funny because that picture, I get little kids coming up, small children, like under 5, saying, like, pointing at the toys, indicating the ones they have at home. I've had conversations with parents who are looking at it, parents that I've kind of come up behind, and they're like, have I screwed up my child beyond all recognition because I bought them a pink umbrella, and so it's I mean, there's impact in that. You can see people immediately thinking about in their own lives, what influence have they had? What did they play with as children? What kind of impact did that have on them? And so we really instantly, I sort of see the impact of that image. And then also the one with the baby on the shoulder. So that's something that, again, I see a lot of women coming up to me at shows or men coming up to me at exhibits and saying, my wife needs to see this. My daughter needs to see this. So in general, there seems to be some, it's almost like externalizing these stories and putting a face to them. And as Stacey said, like adding an emotional kind of component to that, that's really had the most impact because, it's very seldom that I'll be brought to tears by a journal article. Whereas, maybe that's actually possible with an image that can be powerful and speak more than thousands of words.
Right. And so we've got a couple questions who've come in now from Paris Central School and also from Ms. Katsko's class, wondering what these students can do. So we've talked a lot about what some adults can do to help solve these problems. What can our students do moving forward to decrease this discrimination as time goes on? Now, I saw you freeze in the middle there.
Yeah, could you just repeat that? Sorry.
I figured you might need me to. So questions from Paris Central School as well as Ms. Katsko's class again, wondering how the students that are watching today will be able to help solve this problem of discrimination of women in STEM and other fields as well.
Yeah, and I think that's important to talk about because it's not just one field, right, that we're seeing some of these parallels in, but across different industries like we've recently seen in sports and in Hollywood. So what can we do? And I think that really, first of all, you can notice. So, and I mean, bravo for just being here and being willing to have these conversations and being able to talk about something that can be kind of uncomfortable, right? It's a difficult conversation. So you're already doing step one in that you're engaging with the discussion around this. So you're already there, you're already doing it. So I would say then the next step that you can enact in your daily life is to notice. So when something doesn't feel right, when someone says something to you that just doesn't go over well, listen to that intuition. Ask people around you, is this okay? Talk about it. I would encourage you to do that. Then I would encourage you to support the people who are taking action as well. So if you see somebody, don't be a bystander. Stand up. Realize that person who's experiencing discrimination might actually really need you as an ally. And if you're not comfortable doing that, just letting them know that you support their actions, whatever it is that they decide to do, knowing that you can actually really have some impact. And now I'm going to speaking specifically to the male teachers and the male students watching. There's a ton of research showing that if men confront on behalf of women, it's actually seen as more legitimate and they face fewer social costs than women would. So while men are often saying, like, is it my place to confront? How do I do this? I'm saying, you will actually have a really positive impact. So fear not, stand up and confront, because you'll actually have a really good, far-reaching impact.
And maybe we've talked a lot about confronting. Maybe before we go, we could outline a couple of things for what that might look like. So maybe something in a professional sense, what that might look like, and maybe something that might look like for our students that they might encounter and what they might be able to do.
Yeah, so I mean, it's how do we do this, right, in the best way to get the best result for everybody, and that's a situation that the research is pretty clear that you want to be professional in all contexts when you're talking about this. So you specifically, though, when you're using a style to confront with research shows us that using something like education, so saying things like, I know you might feel that way, but did you know that women are actually extremely successful in science? Explaining it, that can be a really good approach. Using humor is an approach that is really understudied and not understood to the best of our ability, but we do know that it works in terms of getting people to at least lighten up a little bit and be more open to have that conversation. If it's a humorous, for instance, 1950 called and they want their gender stereotype back. So there's like a lot of retorts that you can use that are somewhat humorous, and that can sort of de-escalate the situation. And what else you can do is you can always keep a paper trail. So I would recommend that everybody write things down, as you're, if you have something to, in a professional context especially, to articulate your thoughts, it's often best or recommended to do so in a written format for a couple of reasons. One is to, have a record of what you've said, but also to minimize the chances that you'll let your emotions really take over and use an angered approach, which we know is extremely ineffective. So don't use anger, and think about education and humor.
Well, that's good advice. I'm sure at any level that anger tends to be a lot less effective. I can certainly see that being the case. So we should really cut our discussion here. We're well over time, as I'm sure this discussion was kind of expected to go by many, just because it's so complex. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and tell us about your research. Show us how you are merging that data-driven research with a little bit of art that you're passionate about too, to really get an emotional response from people, and for answering our questions today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I really would add, to the students watching, that it's not that you're just going to help to change this culture. You are the culture. So, keep that in mind, that you are an agent of change in your classrooms and in your lives and in the future world as we are going to know it. So it can be shaped by you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Next week on PIR Live Event, we'll talk about stable structures with Dr. Wiebe from McMaster University. So we're getting back to talking about the STEM subjects themselves next week. More information on that webinar and other PIR programming is available at pirweb.org. Thanks so much for tuning in today, everyone. I hope you have a great one.